Richard Maxwell stood in his penthouse office, staring at the Manhattan skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. His hand trembled as he set down his coffee cup. The suitcase was gone. $100,000 in cash vanished from his private elevator. He'd only looked away for a moment while checking his phone. "Janet, get security up here now," he barked into the intercom. His secretary rushed to make the call, but Richard already knew it was useless. The security cameras had been down for maintenance that morning. Just his luck. At 55, Richard had built Maxwell Industries from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. He'd earned every penny through hard work and smart deals. But today, he felt like a fool. That cash was meant for a private investment deal, one that had to happen today. No paper trail, no bank transfers. Now it was all falling apart. His phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his heart stop. Catherine Maxwell, his ex-wife. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since their bitter divorce. She'd walked away with millions, but it wasn't enough. She'd wanted the company too, the company he'd built while she played socialite. "What do you want, Catherine?" His voice was cold as he answered, "Hello, Richard." Her voice was smooth as silk, just like he remembered. "Missing something?" The blood drained from his face. "You? I see you haven't lost your gift for conversation." She laughed softly. "Yes, me. And your precious suitcase is safe and sound." Richard gripped the edge of his desk. "How did you... Does it matter? What matters is what happens next." There was a pause. "Meet me at our old spot, the Italian place in Greenwich Village, 1 hour. I don't have time for games, Catherine. That money is sitting right next to me, Richard. 1 hour. Come alone, or your business partners. Might receive some interesting documents about your creative accounting practices." The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone, his mind racing. Catherine had always been clever, but this was something else. She must have had help. Someone on the inside. But who? His secretary knocked timidly. "Mr. Maxwell, security, is here." "Tell them never mind," he snapped, "and clear my schedule for the next 2 hours." Walking to his private bathroom, Richard splashed cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw the traces of age the last 5 years had carved into his face. The divorce had taken its toll, even if he'd never admit it. Catherine had been more than his wife. She'd been his partner, his confidant, until ambition and jealousy tore them apart. The restaurant was small, tucked away on a quiet street. They'd discovered it by accident, one rainy night early in their marriage when they were still young and dreaming of success. It became their special place, where they celebrated every milestone. The last time they'd been here together was the night before she filed for divorce. Catherine sat at their old table by the window. 5 years hadn't changed her much. Still elegant, still beautiful, with that same knowing smile that had first caught his attention 27 years ago. The suitcase sat on the chair beside her. "You're late," she said, not looking up from her menu. "Cut the act, Catherine. What's your game?" She set down the menu and met his eyes. "Sit down, Richard, you're making a scene." He sat, his jaw clenched. The waiter approached with a bottle of wine, their old favorite. "I took the liberty of ordering," Catherine said, as the waiter poured 2 glasses. "You still drink Brunello, don't you?" "What I drink is none of your business, not anymore." "Oh, Richard," she sighed. "Everything about you is still my business. You made sure of that when you tried to hide those offshore accounts during our divorce." His face went pale. "What are you talking about? Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't keep tabs on the man who swore I'd never see a penny of what we built together?" She took a sip of wine. "I've spent 5 years building." "Fair case, Richard. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every cooked book. You're bluffing." "Am I?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive. "Everything's here. Enough to bury you and Maxwell Industries 10 times over." Richard's hands clenched under the table. "What do you want?" "Simple. I want back in. Full partner, equal. Share. The company needs both of us, Richard. It always did." "You're insane." "No, I'm practical. Look at the stock prices. The board's losing confidence. Rumors about your leadership are spreading. Face it, you're floundering without me." She wasn't wrong. The last few years had been rough. Projects delayed, contracts lost, investors getting nervous. But to let her back in, The suitcase and the drive are yours, she continued, if you agree to my terms. Refuse, and copies of these documents go to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country. The waiter returned with their usual orders, dishes they'd eaten together countless times in happier days. Catherine picked up her fork, as if they were just having a normal lunch. You have until dessert to decide, Richard. Just like the old days, tiramisu and life-changing decisions. She smiled. Remember how we used to plan our future over this same meal? Richard stared at his plate, his mind racing. She had him cornered and she knew it. But there was something else, something in the way she looked at him. This wasn't just about revenge or power. There was pain there, hidden behind her confident smile. The same pain he'd been carrying for 5 years. The tiramisu arrived, just like it had hundreds of times before. Richard watched Catherine take a small bite, savoring it with her eyes closed. Some things never changed. She'd always loved this dessert, claiming it reminded her of their honeymoon in Italy, back when they were young and in love, before money and power complicated everything. Time's up, Richard, Catherine said, setting down her fork. What's it going to be? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Text from Janet, his secretary. Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Zhang called. He's threatening to pull out of the deal if he doesn't. Get the cash today. Richard's stomach churned. The Zhang deal would save 3 of his factories from closing. Thousands of jobs hung in the balance. He looked at Catherine, really looked at her for the first time in years. Behind her, confident. Smile. He saw something familiar. The sharp intelligence that had helped him build his empire in the first place. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. You win, but we do this my way, no announcement until I'm ready. Catherine's smile widened. Of course, darling. We'll need time to smooth things over with the board. She pushed the suitcase toward him. Your money. Mr. Zhang is waiting, isn't he? Richard grabbed the suitcase, trying to hide his surprise. Of course she knew about Zhang. She'd probably planned this whole thing around his schedule. The drive? He asked. Insurance, she replied, slipping it back into her purse. You'll get it when the papers are signed. I've learned not to trust you completely, Richard. As they stood to leave, an elegant young woman approached their table. Richard's heart sank as he recognized her, Jennifer Chen, his current girlfriend, and head of PR at Maxwell Industries. Richard, Jennifer's voice was sharp. I thought you had meetings all afternoon. Catherine's eyes sparkled with amusement. Hello, you must be Jennifer. I've heard so much about you. Jennifer's face flushed. Everyone in the company knew about Catherine Maxwell, the ex-wife who'd almost brought down the empire during their divorce. Mrs. Maxwell, what a surprise. Please call me Catherine. After all, we'll be working together soon. She turned to Richard. You haven't told her yet? Shame on you, Richard. Richard watched helplessly as his past and present collided. Jennifer's expression hardened as she understood what was happening. Working together. Jennifer's voice was ice cold. Richard, what is she talking about? It's complicated, Jennifer. I'll explain everything later. No need, Jennifer snapped. I think I understand perfectly. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the restaurant. Catherine watched her go with a satisfied smile. Well, that was interesting. She seems nice. A bit young, though, don't you think? Damn it, Catherine, was that necessary? Oh, Richard, everything I do is necessary. You taught me that. She gathered her things. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers. Dinner tomorrow? Same time, same place? Before he could answer, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn throughout their marriage. Richard sat back down heavily, ordering a scotch. The waiter, who'd served them for years, gave him a sympathetic look. The signora? She hasn't changed, the old man said softly. No, Mario, she hasn't. Richard stared into his drink. That's what worries me. Back at his office, Richard found Jennifer waiting in his private conference room. Her eyes were red, but her makeup was perfect. Always the professional. I've drafted a press release about my resignation, she said, sliding a paper across the table. I assume you'll want to review it before I send it out. Jennifer, wait, let me explain. Explain what? How your ex-wife is suddenly back in the picture. How you've been meeting her in secret. She laughed bitterly. Do you know what? They call me in the office the replacement. Not Jennifer, not Miss Chen, the replacement, and now I know why. Richard reached for her hand, but she pulled away. It's not what you think. Catherine, she's blackmailing me. Jennifer's eyes widened. What? She has information, documents, things that could destroy everything I've built. Everything we've all built. Then we fight back. We have resources, lawyers. We can... No. Richard's voice was firm. We can't risk it. One hint of scandal and our stock will plummet. The Zhang deal will fall through. Thousands will lose their jobs. Jennifer stood, smoothing her skirt. You're still in love with her, aren't you? What? No, that's not... Save it, Richard. I've seen how you look at her. Even now, after everything she's done. She walked to the door, then paused. You know what the worst part is? I actually thought I could compete with her ghost. What a fool I've been. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He opened his laptop, pulling up old photos he'd never had the heart to delete. There he was with Catherine at the company's first major success party, her arms around. His neck, both of them laughing. Another from their 20th anniversary, her head on his shoulder as they danced. The last photo was from just before everything fell apart. They were at a charity gala, smiling for the cameras, but their eyes were cold, their poses stiff. When had they stopped being partners and started being competitors? His phone buzzed again. A text from Catherine. Don't forget to sign those papers for the Zhang deal. Second drawer of your desk, where you always keep the urgent ones. Richard. Yanked open the drawer. There they were, the papers he'd been looking for all morning. How did she still know his habits so well? Another text followed. And Richard, try to get some sleep. You always make bad decisions when you're tired. He threw the phone across the room, but he couldn't help smiling. Same old Catherine. Always. One step ahead. Maybe she was right about one thing. The company had been better when they were together. But at what cost? The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, Catherine was probably celebrating her victory. Jennifer was probably clearing out her office, and Richard, he was right back where he started, caught between the woman who knew all his secrets and the future he'd thought he wanted. The suitcase sat on his desk, $100,000 still safely inside, but somehow he knew this was just the beginning. Catherine hadn't come back just for money or power. She wanted something else, something more personal. And knowing Catherine, she wouldn't stop until she got it. The next morning, chaos erupted at Maxwell Industries. Jennifer's resignation hit the rumor mill before the markets opened. By 9, the stock had dropped 3 points. By 10, the board was demanding an emergency meeting. Richard sat at the head of the conference table, watching his board members file in. Most of them were old friends, people who'd been with him since the early days. But today, their faces were hard, their eyes suspicious. Care to explain what's going on, Richard? Marcus Peterson, his oldest friend on the board, spoke first. First, the Zhang deal gets delayed, then Jennifer Chen resigns out of nowhere. And now there are rumors about Catherine being seen at your regular restaurant? Before Richard could answer, the conference room door opened. Catherine walked in, dressed in a perfectly tailored business suit, looking as if she'd never left. Good morning, gentlemen, she said, taking the empty seat at the other end of the table. I believe Richard has some news to share. The room erupted in whispers. Richard cleared his throat, fighting down his anger at Catherine's dramatic timing. Yes, well, he straightened his tie. Catherine and I have been in discussions about her returning to the company in an executive capacity. Returning? Marcus stood up. Richard, have you lost your mind? After what happened during the divorce, Catherine's smile never wavered. Ancient history, Marcus. We've both grown since then, haven't we, Richard? The board will need to vote on this, another member spoke up. Of course, Catherine said smoothly. And while you're voting, you might want to consider the Zhang contract. Catherine pulled out a folder, which I've managed to salvage, by the way. Mr. Zhang was quite reasonable once I explained the situation. Richard's head snapped up. You spoke to Zhang? This morning. He's agreed to better terms than you originally negotiated. 10% better, actually. She passed copies of the contract around the table. You'll find everything in order. The board members pored over the documents. their expressions changing from skepticism to interest. Richard knew that look. Catherine had them right where she wanted them. "There's more," she continued. "I've also been in talks with Robinson Technologies about a potential merger. They're interested in our Asian market expansion plans." Another round of murmurs swept the room. Robinson Technologies had been playing hard to get for years. Richard had personally tried to arrange a meeting with their CEO 3 times. "How did you—" Richard started. "Susan Robinson and I play tennis together," Catherine said simply. "Amazing, what you can accomplish over a friendly game." The board meeting lasted another 2 hours. By the end, Catherine's return was approved unanimously. Richard watched helplessly as his board members congratulated her, clearly impressed by her preparation and vision for the company's future. "Well," Catherine said as the last board member left, "that went well, don't you think?" Richard slammed his hand on the table. "You manipulated them." "I presented facts, Richard, something you used to appreciate about me." She walked to the window, looking out at the city. "Remember when we used to stand here together planning our next big move? That was before you tried to take everything from me." She turned, her eyes flashing. "Everything? You're the one who pushed me out. 23 years of marriage, and you treated me like some trophy wife who didn't understand business. You were spending all your time at charity events and spa weekends. I was building relationships. Half our major contracts came from those events, but you were too busy playing CEO to notice." She took a deep breath, composing herself. "It doesn't matter now. We have work to do." Richard watched as she settled into his private office next door, her old office. Within hours, she had her pictures back on the walls, her awards on the shelves. It was like she'd never left. His phone buzzed. A message from Jennifer. "Congratulations on the Jiang deal. Catherine works fast, doesn't she? Don't worry about my resignation. I've already accepted a position with your biggest competitor." Another message followed. "By the way, you might want to check your private files. Some interesting documents seem to be missing." Richard's blood ran cold. He rushed to his safe, punching in the code with trembling fingers. The files were gone. Files that could prove Catherine's involvement in some questionable deals from years ago. Files he'd been saving for protection. His phone buzzed again. Catherine this time. "Looking for something? Check your email." There it was. Scanned copies of every missing document, along with a short note. "Insurance works both ways, darling. See you at dinner." Richard sank into his chair, a grudging smile forming on his face. She'd outplayed him at every turn, just like in the old days. Down the hall he could hear Catherine laughing with some employees, probably charming them just like she'd charmed the board. Her voice carried through the walls, confident, warm, exactly how he remembered it from their better days. His computer pinged. An email from Marcus. "Whatever game you and Catherine are playing, be careful. But I have to admit the company feels alive again, like the old days. The old days, when he and Catherine had been unstoppable together, when every challenge was just another opportunity to prove how well they worked as a team." The sun was setting over Manhattan when Catherine knocked on his door. "Ready for dinner? We have a lot to discuss." "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "Every minute." She smiled, that real smile he remembered from their early years. "Come on, Richard. For once, let's just enjoy our victory like we used to." As they walked to the elevator together, heads turned. Whispers followed them through the lobby. The king and queen of Maxwell Industries reunited. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted. This time, Catherine held all the cards. And somehow, deep down, Richard wasn't sure he minded as much as he should. Days turned into weeks at Maxwell Industries. Catherine's return sent shockwaves through New York's business world. Some called it a brilliant move. Others whispered about scandal and blackmail. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. Richard watched from his office as Catherine charmed a group of international investors. She'd always had a gift for making people feel special, important. He remembered how she'd done the same thing to him all those years ago, when he was just a hungry young businessman with big dreams. "Mr. Maxwell?" His new secretary, Angela, interrupted his thoughts. "Miss Chen is here to see you." Jennifer stood in the doorway looking even more polished than usual in a designer suit. "Hello, Richard. Surprised to see me." "Jennifer." He stood quickly. "I thought you were joining Robertson Corp." "Oh, I did." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "In fact, that's why I'm here. Robertson wants to renegotiate the terms of the merger Catherine proposed." Richard's stomach dropped. "What?" It seems some interesting information came to light. Information about Maxwell Industries' true financial situation. Jennifer placed a thick folder on his desk. Catherine's not the only one who knows how to play this game. Before Richard could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. "Jennifer, what a lovely surprise." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were sharp. "I see you've delivered the proposal personally. How thoughtful." Jennifer turned, her smile equally dangerous. "Catherine, you're looking well. Marriage clearly didn't agree with you. You look years younger." "Divorce is an excellent beauty regimen. You should try it sometime." Catherine moved into the room, like a cat stalking its prey. "Though I suppose you'd need to get married first." "Ladies," Richard interrupted, "perhaps we should focus on business." "Of course," Jennifer said smoothly. "I was just explaining to Richard that Robertson has some concerns about the merger, particularly about certain offshore accounts that seem to have been overlooked during the initial negotiations." Catherine didn't flinch. "Offshore accounts? How interesting. Richard, darling, weren't those the accounts you set up after our divorce? The ones you thought I didn't know about?" Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He'd forgotten how dangerous Catherine could be when cornered. "Now, Jennifer," Catherine continued, "since we're all being so honest, shall we discuss your recent meetings with Marcus Peterson? The ones where you promised him a seat on Robertson's board if he helped block my return?" Jennifer's confident smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No? Then I suppose these photos of you and Marcus at the Four Seasons last week are just friendly lunch meetings." Catherine pulled out her phone, showing a series of damning images. "The SEC takes a dim view of corporate espionage, dear. You had me followed? Let's just say I like to keep track of my investments." Catherine's smile was razor sharp. "Now why don't we discuss the real reason you're here?" Jennifer's composure cracked. "You think you've won, don't you? The prodigal wife returns, takes back her kingdom. But you don't know everything, Catherine. You don't know what Richard's been doing these past 5 years. On the contrary." Catherine sat on the edge of Richard's desk. "I know exactly what he's been doing. Every deal, every mistake, every lonely night with a bottle of scotch in his office. The question is, do you know what I've been doing?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Richard watched these two formidable women face off, suddenly feeling like a spectator in his own drama. "I've spent 5 years building a network," Catherine continued. "Friends in high places, secrets in low places. Did you really think you could outmaneuver me with a few stolen documents and a vindictive heart?" Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her purse. "This isn't over?" "Oh, but it is." Catherine's voice was almost kind. "Go back to Robertson. Tell them the merger is proceeding as planned, under my terms. And Jennifer, the next time you want to play in the big leagues, make sure you know all the players first." After Jennifer left, Richard poured himself a drink. Was all that necessary? She needed to learn a lesson. Catherine took the glass from his hand and sipped it herself. "Never threaten what's mine, yours." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I thought we were just business partners now." Catherine moved closer, her perfume bringing back a flood of memories. "Are we, Richard? Is that all we are?" Before he could answer, Marcus burst into the office. "Richard, Catherine, turn on the news now." The flat screen on the wall came to life, showing a breaking news report. The headline made Richard's heart stop. "Federal investigation into Maxwell Industries announced." Sources say the investigation centers around suspicious financial activities dating back 5 years, the reporter announced. "The SEC has received anonymous tips about potential fraud and market manipulation." Catherine's face went pale. 5 years ago, Richard, that's when we were divorcing," he finished. "When we both made decisions we shouldn't have." They looked at each other, really looked at each other, for the first time in years. All the anger, all the games, all the manipulation suddenly seemed pointless in the face of this new threat. "We need to talk," Catherine said quietly. "About everything." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of 5 years of secrets pressing down on him. "Yes, we do, but not here." "The beach house?" Catherine suggested. "It's still there, I never sold my half." The beach house, their private sanctuary for 23 years, the place where they'd made their biggest decisions, celebrated their greatest victories, weathered their worst storms. "Meet me there in 2 hours," Richard said. "And Catherine, bring the USB drive, all of them." She smiled sadly. "You too, Richard. Bring all your secrets. It's time we stopped playing games." As they prepared to face their past together, neither noticed Jennifer watching from her car across the street, a satisfied smile on her face as she dialed a number. "It worked," she said into the phone. "They took the bait. Operation Takedown is officially in motion." The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the city. In his office, Richard stared at the suitcase that had started it all, wondering if losing that money was the best thing that could have happened to him, or the worst mistake of his life. Only time would tell. And time, as both he and Catherine had learned, had a way of revealing all secrets. The beach house stood exactly as they'd left it 5 years ago. Catherine arrived first, using her old key to unlock the door. The furniture was still covered with white sheets, like ghosts of their past life together. She pulled one off the sofa, sending up a cloud of dust. Memories flooded back. Summer weekends, holiday parties, quiet moments when they needed to escape the city. This house had been their refuge, their secret place away from the corporate warfare and social obligations. Richard arrived just as the sun was setting, carrying a briefcase and looking tired. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, something he only did when truly stressed. "You kept everything the same," he said, looking around. "We both did." Catherine gestured to the covered furniture. "Neither of us could bear to change it, could we?" They sat across from each other in their old spots. Catherine on the sofa, Richard in his leather armchair. The sound of waves crashing outside filled the silence between them. "So," Catherine said, pulling out a USB drive. "Shall we begin?" Richard placed his briefcase on the coffee table. "Ladies, first, always the gentleman." She plugged the drive into her laptop. "Let's start with the truth about the Jiang deal, the real truth." Documents filled the screen. Emails, contracts, bank statements. Richard leaned forward, his face growing pale as he read. "Jiang was never going to sign with us," Catherine explained. "He was working with Jennifer the whole time. They planned to drive our stock down, then buy up shares at rock-bottom prices." "How did you know?" "Because I've been watching Jennifer since the day you hired her." Catherine's voice was hard. "Did you really think it was a coincidence that your new girlfriend happened to be a corporate expert in hostile takeovers?" Richard ran his hands through his hair. "She played me. We both got played, Richard." Catherine pulled up more documents. "Look at this. While we were fighting over the company during our divorce, someone else was quietly buying up shares through shell companies. Want to guess who?" "Marcus," Richard said quietly. "That's why he was meeting with Jennifer." "Bingo." Catherine smiled grimly. "Our old friend Marcus has been playing both sides. He helped me get back into the company while helping Jennifer set up the Robertson deal. He probably thought he could profit, no matter who won." Richard opened his briefcase, pulling out his own stack of documents. "Then you should see these. Remember those missing files from my safe? There was a reason I kept them." Catherine read through the papers, her face growing darker. "The Panama accounts, the ones we set up together. Not just those." Richard spread out more documents. "These show every deal we ever made that wasn't quite legal. Every shortcut we took building this company. If these get out, we both go down." Catherine finished his thought. "And not just us. The whole company. Thousands of jobs, gone." They sat in silence, letting the weight of their situation sink in. 25 years of business deals, moral compromises, and shared secrets lay spread out between them. "What happened to us, Richard?" Catherine's voice was soft. "We used to be partners in everything. Success happened. Money happened." He stood, walking to the window. "We started caring more about winning than about each other. And now Jennifer's using our own tactics against us." Catherine joined him at the window. The student becomes the master. She's not alone. Richard turned to face her. The SEC investigation, that was too perfectly timed. Someone else is pulling the strings. Catherine's eyes widened. Robert. My brother. Richard shook his head. He's been in Europe for years. Exactly. The perfect alibi. Catherine pulled up another document on her laptop. Look at these wire transfers, all from Swiss banks, all to companies connected to Jennifer. And guess who's been living in Switzerland? The pieces started falling into place. Robert had always resented being the younger brother, the one who got a trust fund while Richard built an empire. He'd spent years living off his inheritance, watching from afar as his brother became more and more successful. He's been planning this for years, Richard realized. The SEC investigation, Jennifer, all of it. He's trying to take everything. Not trying, Catherine corrected. Succeeding. Unless what? She moved closer, her hand finding his arm like it used to years ago. Unless we work together. Really together. Like we used to. No more games. No more secrets. Richard looked down at her hand on his arm. How many times had she steadied him like this? How many battles had they won together? It won't be easy, he said. There's too much history between us. When has that ever stopped us? Her eyes met his. Remember what you used to say. The bigger the risk, the bigger the reward, he finished. Their old motto from the early days when they were young and fearless. A noise from outside made them both jump. Headlights swept across the windows as a car pulled into the driveway. Are you expecting someone? Catherine asked. No. Richard moved to the window. It's Jennifer's car, and is that Marcus with her? Catherine quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into her laptop bag. We need to go. Now. There's a back door through the kitchen, Richard said, grabbing his briefcase. Just like old times, just like old times. They slipped out just as they heard keys in the front door. Jennifer's voice carried through the house. They have to be here. Both their cars are outside. Richard and Catherine ran through the darkness toward the beach, their feet sinking. In the soft sand. Behind them, lights flicked on in the beach house. My car's parked around the corner, Catherine whispered. If we can just... A figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of them. The moonlight revealed a familiar face, one they hadn't seen in 5 years. Going somewhere? Robert Maxwell smiled. Hello, brother Catherine, we need to talk. The waves crashed behind them as Richard and Catherine stood frozen, caught between their past and their future, with nowhere left to run. Robert Maxwell hadn't changed much in 5 years. Still handsome, still well-dressed, still wearing that smug smile that had always driven Richard crazy. But there was something different in his eyes now, something cold and calculating. What do you want, Robert? Richard moved slightly in front of Catherine, an old protective instinct kicking in. What do I want? Robert laughed. That's rich coming from you, big brother. You've always had everything, the company, the success, the perfect wife. Well, ex-wife now. Jennifer and Marcus approached from behind, completing the trap. The sound of waves crashing against the shore almost drowned out their footsteps in the sand. I have to admit, Jennifer said, you two were easier to manipulate than I expected. A stolen suitcase, a few threatening phone calls, and you both fell right into place. Catherine's grip tightened on her laptop bag. So the money in the suitcase was just bait, Robert finished. We needed you back in the company, Catherine. Your signature on certain documents, your fingerprints on certain deals. The SEC doesn't just want Richard's head. They want both of you. You're behind the federal investigation, Richard said, the pieces finally clicking into place. Actually, that was my contribution. Marcus stepped forward. 20 years of friendship, Richard, and you never once offered me a real piece of the company. Always keeping me at arm's length, just like you did with Robert. The moonlight cast. Long shadows on the beach as the group faced each other. Years of resentment, betrayal, and secrets hung in the air between them. So what's the plan? Catherine's voice was steady, but Richard could hear the tension in it. Turn us in to the SEC, take control of the company while we're fighting criminal charges. Oh, it's much simpler than that, Robert smiled. You're going to sign over. Your shares, both of you, voluntarily and quietly. And why would we do that? Richard demanded. Jennifer pulled out her phone, showing them a video. It was security footage from their old office dated 5 years ago. Richard and Catherine were arguing, but it wasn't just any argument. "That's the night Thompson died," Catherine whispered. Richard felt his blood run cold. Harold Thompson had been their biggest investor, and his death had always been ruled an accident, a heart attack during a late-night meeting. But the security footage told a different story. "Amazing what you can find when you start digging," Robert said. "How do you think the SEC will react when they see this, when they realize that Maxwell Industries was built on more than just creative? Accounting? You're bluffing." Richard tried to sound confident, but his voice shook slightly. "Am I?" Robert nodded to Jennifer, who pulled out a thick envelope. "These are copies of everything. The video, the autopsy report showing Thompson's real cause of death, the bribes paid to cover it up. By this time tomorrow they could be on every news channel in the country." Catherine stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "What makes you think we don't have insurance of our own?" "Because I know my brother," Robert's smile widened. "And I know you, Catherine. You're both too proud to keep evidence of your own crimes. That would be admitting you might fail." He was right, and they all knew it. Richard and Catherine had been so careful covering their tracks, so confident in their ability to handle any crisis, that they'd never considered keeping proof of others' wrongdoing. "You have until morning," Jennifer said. "Sign over the shares, and this all goes away. Refuse." She let the threat hang in the air. "We need time to think," Richard said. "You have until sunrise." Robert checked his expensive watch. "That gives you about 6 hours. We'll be waiting at the house." As Robert, Jennifer, and Marcus walked back toward the beach house, Catherine turned to Richard. In the moonlight, he could see tears in her eyes, something he'd only seen once before, the day she filed for divorce. "They've won, haven't they?" she whispered. Richard took her hand, feeling its slight tremor. "Not yet. Remember the Milano deal?" Catherine's eyes widened slightly. The Milano deal had been their closest call 10 years ago. Everyone had thought, "They were finished then too. You still have it?" she asked. "In the place we never talk about." He squeezed her hand. "We need to get to the city, now." They ran to Catherine's car, sand flying beneath their feet. As they pulled away from the beach house, Richard could see Robert watching from the window, probably thinking he'd finally beaten his older brother. "Call Angela," Richard told Catherine as they sped toward Manhattan. "Tell her to meet us at the old place. And Catherine?" He turned to look at her. "Whatever happens next, I'm sorry. For everything." She kept her eyes on the key road, but her voice softened. "I know, me too." The city lights grew larger as they raced against time. Behind them, the beach house grew smaller, taking with it the last remnants of their past life. Whatever happened next would change everything. Again. "Richard?" Catherine's voice was quiet. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd just been honest with each other? If we'd trusted each other instead of letting pride tear us apart?" He looked at her profile, remembering all the times he'd seen her just like this, determined, fierce, ready for battle. His perfect match in every way. "Maybe we're about to find out," he said. The car sped through the night, carrying them toward their last chance at redemption. In the distance, the first hints of dawn began to color the sky. Time was running out, but for the first time in 5 years, they were facing it together, and together, they had always been unstoppable. Manhattan was eerily quiet at 3 in the morning. Catherine's car pulled up in front of an old brownstone in the Lower East Side. Angela, Richard's secretary, was already waiting on the steps, clutching a large envelope. "I got everything you asked for," Angela said as they hurried inside. "But, Mr. Maxwell, there's something else you need to know." The brownstone's interior was dusty and dark. It had been their first office, back when Maxwell Industries was just a dream shared between a young married couple. They'd kept it all these years, hidden under a different company name. "What is it, Angela?" Richard asked as they climbed the creaking stairs. "Jennifer's been accessing the company servers all week. She's been copying files, but she's also been planting new ones. Documents with your signatures, both of yours, dated this year." Catherine stopped at the top of the stairs. "Forged documents showing we've been working together all along. They're creating a paper trail." "Making it look like we never really divorced," Richard realized. that everything since then has been an elaborate scheme to hide assets. They entered what had once been their first boardroom. An old table still stood in the center, covered in years of dust. Richard went straight to the far wall, running his hands along the wooden panels until he found what he was looking for. A hidden compartment. Clicked open. "The Milano files," he said, pulling out a small safe. "The one piece of evidence we kept, even though we swore we'd destroy it." Catherine watched as he opened the safe with trembling fingers. After all these years, inside was a single USB drive and a stack of photographs. Angela gasped as she looked at them. "Is that Robert?" Catherine nodded. "From 15 years ago. The real reason he went to Europe. The photos showed Robert in a series of clandestine meetings with known criminals. The USB drive contained records of money laundering, fraud and worse, all traced back to Robert Maxwell. He was using company funds to finance illegal operations," Richard explained to Angela. "When we found out, we gave him a choice. Leave the country or face prosecution. We covered it up to protect the company," Catherine added, "and to protect Richard's mother. It would have killed her to know the truth about her younger son." Angela looked between them. "But why keep this if it was so dangerous?" "Insurance," they said together, then shared, a small smile at the synchronicity. "But we can't use it," Richard said heavily. "If this gets out, it won't just destroy Robert. The scandal would take down the whole company. Thousands of innocent people would lose their jobs." Catherine touched his arm. "Maybe we don't have to use it. Maybe just having it is enough." A noise from downstairs made them all freeze. Footsteps, more than one person. "How did they find us?" Angela whispered. "Marcus," Catherine's face hardened. "He must have had us followed." Richard quickly put the USB drive and photos back in the safe. "Angela, take the back stairs. Get these documents somewhere safe. Catherine and I will handle this." "Like old times?" Catherine's eyes met his. "Like old times." As Angela slipped out through a hidden door, another relic from their early days of corporate espionage, Richard and Catherine faced the main entrance. The footsteps grew closer. "Whatever happens," Catherine said quietly, "I want you to know something. I never stopped." The door burst open. But it wasn't Robert or Jennifer who entered. It was Sarah Thompson, Harold Thompson's widow, followed by two men in suits. "Hello, Richard." "Catherine." Sarah's voice was cold. "I believe it's time we talked about what really happened to my husband." Richard felt Catherine's hand find his under the table. They'd faced many crises together. But this was the one secret they'd thought was buried forever. Sarah sat down across from them, placing a familiar-looking suitcase on the table, the same one that had started this whole chain of events. "Interesting thing about this suitcase," she said, opening it to reveal not money but files. "Harold always kept records of everything. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Harold Thompson hadn't just been their biggest investor. He'd been their confidant, their mentor, and ultimately their victim." "Sarah," Catherine started, but the older woman held up her hand. "Save it. I've waited 5 years to have this conversation. And now, thanks to your brother's clumsy attempt at revenge, I finally have my chance." Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Somewhere across town, Robert and Jennifer were waiting for an answer they'd never receive, because the game had just changed completely. Sarah Thompson pulled out a document from the suitcase. "Now let's talk about what really happened that night, and about what happens next." Richard and Catherine exchanged glances. The past was finally catching up with them, and this time, there might not be an escape. Sarah Thompson hadn't aged much. In 5 years. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her clothes still expensive and immaculate, but there was something different about her, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "You know," she said, spreading out documents on the dusty table, "Harold always said you two were his greatest success story, the power couple he'd backed when no one else would, his protégés." "Sarah, we never meant," Catherine began. "To kill him?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "No, I suppose you didn't. But that's what happened, isn't it?" Richard leaned forward. "It was an accident. You have to believe that." "An accident?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Let's review what my husband's records show, shall we? The night of his death, he discovered something Something about certain overseas accounts that didn't quite add up. She pulled out a particular document, sliding it across the table. Catherine's face went pale as she read it. "The Singapore funds," she whispered. "Exactly." Sarah nodded. "Harold found out you were using company money to build a secret empire, one that even your own board didn't know about. When he confronted you—" "He had a heart attack," Richard insisted. "The autopsy proved it." "The autopsy you paid for?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The one performed by Dr. Matthews, who coincidentally received a very generous grant from a Maxwell Industries subsidiary the following month." The silence in the room was deafening. Through the dusty windows, the first rays of sunrise were beginning to paint the sky pink. "What do you want, Sarah?" Catherine finally asked. "Justice. Revenge." Sarah shook her head. "I've had 5 years to think about that. What I want is something much simpler. I want the truth. And I want back what was stolen from me." "Stolen?" Richard frowned. "Don't play dumb, Richard. It doesn't suit you." Sarah pulled out another document. "The night Harold died, he had proof of your secret accounts. Accounts worth billions, not millions. Money that should have gone to his widow and children." Catherine stood up suddenly. "The notebook, that's what this is really about, isn't it?" Sarah's eyes glittered. "So you remember. Harold's black notebook." Catherine walked to the window. "He carried it everywhere, wrote down everything in it. The combination to his personal safe, account numbers, passwords. The key to his entire empire," Sarah finished, "which conveniently disappeared the night he died." Richard watched the two women, his mind racing. The notebook had been their insurance policy, their protection against Harold ever exposing their schemes. But they'd never actually used it. After his death, Catherine had insisted on hiding it away, too guilty to profit from their mentor's death. "It's here, isn't it?" Sarah looked around the old office. "In this building. This is why you kept this place all these years." Before either of them could respond, footsteps thundered up the stairs. Robert burst in, followed by Jennifer and Marcus. All three were out of breath. "Did you really think we wouldn't figure it out?" Robert sneered. "The old office. So sentimental of you, Richard." Jennifer moved to block the back door. "The documents. Where are they?" "You're too late," Catherine said calmly. "Angela's already gone with them." "Angela?" Marcus laughed. "You mean her?" He stepped aside to reveal Angela being led in by one of Sarah's men, looking terrified. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "They caught me on the back stairs." Richard felt his last hope crumbling. But then he saw something in Catherine's eyes, a familiar spark he hadn't seen in years. "Well," Catherine said, moving casually toward the old fireplace, "I suppose there's nothing left to hide." She pressed a hidden switch and a panel in the wall slid open. Inside was Harold's notebook, exactly where they'd hidden it 5 years ago. "Catherine, no!" Richard stepped forward, but Robert's men held him back. "It's over, Richard," she said, softly. "We lost." Sarah reached for the notebook with trembling hands. "After all these years?" But as she opened it, Catherine smiled. "You know what Harold always said about keeping records?" She pulled a lighter from her pocket and flicked it on. In one smooth motion, she grabbed the notebook back and held the flame to its edge. He said sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to destroy them. The notebook caught fire instantly. Sarah screamed. Robert and his men lunged forward, but they were too late. "You fools!" Sarah shrieked. "Do you know what you've done?" "Oh yes," Catherine said, watching the pages. "Burn. We've just made sure nobody wins. The only copy of those account numbers, those passwords, gone. The money stays where it is, out of everyone's reach." Robert grabbed her shoulders. "Where are the accounts? Tell me." "Even if we wanted to," Richard said, finally understanding. "Catherine's plan, we couldn't. We've never accessed them. The numbers were only in that notebook." Sarah sank into a chair, watching her revenge turn to ashes. 5 years. I waited 5 years. "And now we all have a choice," Catherine said, brushing off Robert's hands. "We can destroy each other, expose everything. The SEC investigation. Harold's death, Robert's crimes, Sarah's conspiracy. We'll all go down together. Or," Jennifer asked, speaking for the first time, "or we walk away. All of us." With exactly what we had yesterday, nothing more, nothing less. The room was silent except for the crackling of the burning paper. The sun had fully risen now, filling the room with golden light. "She's right," Richard said. "It's over. The money's gone. The evidence is gone. We've all lost." Robert looked at Jennifer, then at Marcus. Sarah stared at the ashes of her husband's notebook. One by one, the fight seemed to drain out of them. "This isn't finished," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Catherine replied. "Go back to Europe, Robert. Live your life. Let us live ours." As their enemies filed out of the room defeated, Richard turned to Catherine. "You knew. All these years, you knew where the notebook was." "Of course I did. Just like I knew you'd never use those photos of Robert. Some things are more important than winning." He took her hand, feeling the warmth of it, the familiar strength. "What do we do now?" She smiled. That real smile he'd fallen in love with so many years ago. "We start over together if you want to." Outside, Manhattan was waking up. Another day of business as usual. But in that dusty old office where it had all begun, something was ending, and something else, perhaps, was beginning again. The next few days passed in a blur of damage control. The SEC investigation mysteriously disappeared after an anonymous source provided evidence clearing Maxwell Industries of any wrongdoing. Robert boarded a private jet back to Switzerland, taking Jennifer with him. Sarah Thompson held a press conference announcing her late husband's foundation would be partnering with Maxwell Industries on a new charitable initiative. Life somehow went on. Richard sat in his office, watching the morning news coverage. The business channels were buzzing with speculation about the company's future, but the worst seemed to be over. "Your coffee," Catherine said, walking in with 2 cups. She'd stayed late every night this week, helping him sort through the mess their lives had become. "And the latest stock reports. We're up 3 points." "Thank you." He took the coffee, their fingers brushing slightly. "Have you seen this?" He handed her the morning paper. The society pages featured a large photo of them at last night's charity gala, standing close together, laughing at something. The headline read, "Maxwell Reunion Business's Most Famous Couple Sparks Reconciliation Rumors." "The vultures are circling again," Catherine smiled, but there was a softness in her eyes. "Just like old times." "Catherine," Richard stood, moving around his desk. "About what you said at the old office, about starting over." A knock at them. Dur interrupted them. Marcus stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping into the office. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now." "You're lucky we don't have you arrested for corporate espionage," Catherine said coldly. "I deserve that. I deserve worse." Marcus sat heavily in a chair. "That's why I'm here, to confess everything." Richard and Catherine exchanged glances. After everything that had happened, what more confessions could there be? "The night Harold died," Marcus began, his voice shaking. "I was there too." The coffee cup slipped from Catherine's hand, shattering on the floor. "What?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "I was meeting him secretly. He'd found out about some of my own indiscretions, threatened to expose me." Marcus couldn't meet their eyes. "When he confronted you both about the Singapore accounts, I was hiding in his private office. I saw everything." Catherine sank into a chair. "You saw—" "I saw him have the heart attack, yes. I saw you both try to help him. And I saw something else, something you didn't know about." Richard's hands gripped the edge of his desk. "What are you talking about?" "Harold had taken medication that night, pills that weren't his usual prescription. I saw him take them just before your meeting." Marcus finally looked up. Pills that Jennifer had given him earlier that day. The silence in the room was deafening. Catherine's face had gone pale. "Jennifer," she whispered. "But that's impossible. She didn't even work here then." "No," Marcus agreed. "Back then she worked for Robertson Corp. They'd been trying to take over Maxwell Industries for years. Harold was their way in." Richard sat down heavily. "They poisoned him? The pills were meant to cause symptoms that looked like a heart attack, but the dose was wrong. Instead of just making him sick enough to be taken to the hospital." Marcus trailed off. Where he would have signed over control to Robertson while under duress, Catherine finished. My God, why are you telling us this now? Richard demanded. Because Jennifer's back. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing them a news alert. She never left for Switzerland with Robert. She's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Catherine grabbed the phone, reading quickly. She's going to expose everything. Harold's death, the Singapore accounts, all of it. Not everything, Marcus said. She doesn't know I saw her with Harold that day. She doesn't know I have proof. Richard stood suddenly. Proof? What proof? Harold wasn't the only one who kept records. Marcus pulled a small recorder from his pocket. I recorded everything that night, including my conversation with Jennifer afterward, when she thought her plan had worked perfectly. Catherine took the recorder with trembling hands. You've had this for 5 years. Why didn't you come forward? Because I was a coward, Marcus said simply. Because it was easier to play both sides, to profit from everyone's secrets. But watching you two this past week, seeing how you faced everything together, it made me realize some things are more important than money. Richard walked to the window, looking out at the city they'd built together. If we use this recording, Jennifer goes to prison. The truth about Harold's death comes out. But the truth will show we tried to save him, Catherine said softly. That we were victims of Robertson's plot, not murderers. And the Singapore accounts. Richard turned back to her. Those were real. We did build a secret empire. Catherine stood, moving to his side. An empire we never touched. Money we couldn't bring ourselves to use because of what happened that night. Marcus cleared his throat. The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. Jennifer's planned quite a show. Press, prosecutors, everyone will be there. Then we better be ready, Catherine said. One last battle. Richard looked at her, really looked at her. The woman who'd stood by his side for 23 years of marriage. The woman who'd fought him tooth and nail during their divorce. The woman who'd come back when he needed her most. Together? He asked. She took his hand, squeezing it gently. Together. As Marcus left them to prepare for tomorrow's showdown, Catherine turned to Richard. You know, you never finished what you were going to say about starting over. He pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. Maybe some things don't need to be said. Maybe they just need to be proven. Outside his office, the city hummed with life. Somewhere, out there, Jennifer was preparing for what she thought would be her moment of triumph. But she didn't know what Richard and Catherine had learned long ago. That true power isn't in the secrets you keep, but in the trust you build. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own revelations. But for now, in the quiet of his office, Richard held the only truth that mattered. The woman who'd always been his perfect match, in love and in war. The Maxwell Industries boardroom was packed. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like hungry eyes. Jennifer stood at the head of the table, sleek and confident in a designer suit, laying out documents for her presentation. Where are they? She whispered to her assistant. They're late. As if on cue, the double doors swung open. Richard and Catherine walked in together, hand in hand. The room erupted in whispers. Camera flashes exploded. Sorry we're late, Catherine smiled, taking her old seat. Traffic was terrible. Jennifer's eyes narrowed at their joined hands, at their calm demeanor. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were supposed to be panicked, desperate. Well, Jennifer cleared her throat. Now that everyone's here, we can begin. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, members of the press, I've called this meeting to expose a terrible truth about Maxwell Industries. She clicked her remote, and the screen behind her lit up with documents. 5 years ago, Harold Thompson died in this very building. His death was ruled a heart attack, but I have evidence that suggests otherwise. The room grew quiet. Richard felt Catherine's hand tighten in his. Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell, or should I say Mr. Maxwell and his ex-wife, conspired to hide billions in secret accounts. When Harold Thompson discovered their scheme, That's quite enough, Jennifer. The new voice came from the back of the room. Sarah Thompson stood in the doorway, elegant in black. Mrs. Thompson, Jennifer's confidence wavered slightly. I didn't expect you to be here, clearly. Sarah walked to the front of the room. "But then, there's a lot you didn't expect, isn't there?" She nodded to someone. Outside, and 2 police detectives entered the boardroom. Jennifer's face went pale. "What is this?" Marcus stood up from his seat at the board table. "The truth, Jennifer. The whole truth." He pulled out the recorder, pressing play. Jennifer's voice filled the room. "It's done. The pills worked exactly as planned. By the time anyone found him, it looked like a natural heart attack." The recording continued, detailing the entire plot. Jennifer's face grew paler with each word. The reporters in the back of the room were scribbling frantically. "You see," Catherine spoke up, "while you were busy planning your big reveal, we were doing some investigating of our own. The Singapore accounts? They were real. A secret empire we built but never used, because the guilt of that night stopped. Hers? But Harold's death wasn't our fault," Richard continued. "We tried to save him. The security footage you found, it shows us performing CPR, calling for help. What it doesn't show is how you poisoned him hours earlier." The police detectives moved forward. Jennifer looked wildly around the room, seeking an ally, an escape route. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually," Sarah stepped forward, "we can. You made one huge mistake, Jennifer. You forgot that my husband's office had a second security system, one that recorded everything, including you giving him those pills." Jennifer lunged for her briefcase, but the detectives were faster. As they led her away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time. "Robert will expose everything. He has copies of all the documents." "Robert's not going to be exposing anything," Marcus said. "He's too busy dealing with his own legal troubles in Switzerland. It seems someone anonymously tipped off the authorities about his illegal activities." As the boardroom slowly emptied, reporters rushing off to file their stories, Richard and Catherine remained seated. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the diamond ring that had somehow found its way back onto Catherine's finger. "Well," she said softly, "that was quite a show." "Indeed it was," Richard smiled, "but I think I'm ready for a quieter life. How about you? What did you have in mind? Remember that little vineyard in Tuscany we always talked about buying? The one near where we spent our honeymoon?" Catherine's eyes lit up. "You didn't." "I did." "Well, we did. I used some of those Singapore accounts, legitimately this time. It's all perfectly legal and documented." "Running away to Italy?" She pretended to consider it. "What about the company? Marcus will make an excellent CEO. He's learned his lesson about loyalty, and he knows the business almost as well as we do. And Sarah? She's agreed to join the board. Her foundation will work closely with Maxwell Industries to help disadvantaged children. It's what Harold would have wanted." Catherine stood, pulling Richard up with her. "So this is really it? Our happy ending?" "Well," he pulled her close, "maybe more like a new beginning." They walked out of the boardroom together, leaving behind the schemes and secrets that had defined their lives for so long. In the lobby, employees stopped to stare, some smiling, some whispering behind their hands. "You know what this means?" Catherine said as they stepped into the elevator. "We're going to be the talk of the town again. Let them talk." Richard kissed her softly. "We've got a plane to catch." As they drove away from Maxwell Industries, neither looked back. The empire they'd built would survive without them, stronger now for having weathered the storm. "You never did tell me," Catherine said as they headed toward the airport. "What made you decide to trust me again?" Richard thought about the stolen suitcase that had started it all, about the games they'd played and the truths they'd finally faced. "I realized something," he said, taking her hand. "All these years, all these schemes and power plays, they were just our way of staying in each other's lives, because neither of us could bear to really let go. So we needed a crisis to bring us back together. We needed a reminder of who we really are, together and apart." The city skyline receded behind them as their car headed toward the airport. Somewhere in Tuscany, a vineyard was waiting. A new life was waiting. "You know," Catherine smiled, "for 2 people who built an empire on secrets, we're surprisingly bad at hiding the most important thing." "What's that?" "That we never stopped loving each other." Richard squeezed her hand, remembering all the moments that had led them here, the triumphs and betrayals, the fights and reconciliations, the lost fortunes and found truths. Maybe that's the one secret we don't have to keep anymore. The morning sun painted the sky in brilliant colors as their car turned onto the airport road. Behind them, Manhattan's towers gleamed like golden promises. Ahead lay a future neither of them could have predicted when this all began. But then, the best stories are often the ones we never see coming.